much. I'm very grateful for this invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Before we get bogged down in some of the details about verification, I just want to talk a bit more broadly about how I see verification fitting in with any serious quest to get to zero. And I guess there's two fundamental different philosophies amongst those of us who believe that zero is the right goal. And the first one is to argue that a world without nuclear weapons would necessarily be safer than a world with nuclear weapons, that disarmament would be an unconditionally stabilizing thing. And then the second philosophy that I subscribe to is that abolition may or may not make the world secure, depending on what the accompanying conditions are. And the way that I see it is there's potentially three different conditions that would have to be in place for a world without nuclear weapons to be at least as safe and secure as one with nuclear weapons. You would have to have very good enforcement, very good verification that I'm going to be talking about today. You'd have to have very good enforcement. You'd have to be able to do something if you spotted a violation, which I'm also going to touch on today. And then third and most fundamentally is the states that have nuclear weapons would have to feel that they could protect their vital interests without nuclear weapons. One can agree or disagree about whether it would ever be possible to reach those conditions. But what I want to point out on the subject of irresponsible assumptions is that one is not comparing a world without nuclear weapons to a world with perfect security. One is comparing a hypothetical world without nuclear weapons to today's world with all the inherent risks of having nuclear weapons. And as I said, one can agree or disagree about whether it's possible to create a world that's less risky than today's one. But to downplay or ignore the risks in today's world does seem to me to be an irresponsible assumption. As I said, verification, I think, is one of those three different conditions that would have to be met. And I would argue actually the easiest of the three. Though from my talk today, very much not a solved problem. And continuing the theme of threes, the way that I see it is there are three different verification challenges. The first one is that all of the nuclear weapons, warheads, facilities that states have today would have to be dismantled in a verified way. Second challenge would be verifying that peaceful nuclear programs are not diverted for military purposes, essentially what the IAEA does today. Now, both of those first two problems are what I would put in the category of soluble problems, in the sense that I don't think we yet know well enough how to verify the dismantlement of warheads. I think there's issues with IAEA safeguards on declared nuclear facilities. But at the end of the day, I think if the political will is there, and the weapon states just locked a bunch of scientists in a room and said you can't come out until you find a solution to these problems, I'm relatively confident that those two problems could be solved. The much harder problem, I think, is verifying the absence of undeclared nuclear material. That is, if we were in a nuclear world without nuclear weapons, how would we know that the UK or the US or India or China or North Korea or whoever hadn't secretly retained nuclear material, which may or may not be in the form of warheads? At a conceptual level, I think there's a solution to this problem. What would have to happen is that all of the weapon states, in fact maybe all states, would have to declare in detail how much nuclear material they've produced. They would have to declare how much they've used. And using that information, which an inspectorate would have to verify, you could work out how much nuclear material ought to be present in a state. Then the inspectors could go and measure how much nuclear material actually was present. And you hope, in theory, that those two quantities would be equal. Well, the interesting thing is that two states have actually tried to do this exercise, and they've published the results, and that's the UK and the US. What happened in the US was the US looked through its records and it tried to work out how much nuclear material it thought it had, and it calculated that it ought to have 102 tons of plutonium. When it actually went and did the measurements, it found it had 99 tons of plutonium. 3 tons of plutonium were missing, as it were. There was also a missing highly enriched, about 3 tons of missing highly enriched uranium. Now, this material wasn't actually missing, almost certainly. It hadn't been lost. But the records were incomplete and imperfect, so the US didn't actually know exactly how much plutonium and highly enriched uranium it had produced. And every time you measure, there's an error. And if you make literally hundreds of thousands or millions of measurements over tens of years, those errors add up. So the reason why there was this missing this seemingly missing plutonium and uranium was because of, as I say, incomplete records and lots of measurement errors. You know, the US had no reason to lie about this. This was a voluntary program. The problem is, if this was an inspectorate, how would the inspectorate know that this discrepancy was because of benign reasons like measurement errors, as opposed to unbenign reasons like the fact the US had just secreted away 3 tons of plutonium? This is a problem I want to emphasize in every single state. I highlight the US because the US has actually done the exercise. There's actually facts, there's actually the US went back and tried to do this exercise. But any state that tried to do this would inevitably find a discrepancy between the amount of nuclear material it expected to have and the amount that was actually present. And it could be very hard, if not impossible, to determine whether this discrepancy was benign or because of cheating. Second problem the inspectorate would face is verifying past records. The US, or India, or China, or Russia, or whoever, could declare that they had produced 100 tons of plutonium. But how would the inspectorate actually know that? Well, technology has a role to play. Most plutonium was produced in graphite-moderated reactors, and you can take samples from the graphite in the reactor, and you can estimate how much plutonium has been produced, and that's good to about 5%. The problem is that 5% in a reactor that's been operating for a few decades is equivalent to a few nuclear weapons. Moreover, heavy water reactors, such as those used in India, there's no equivalent technique for estimating past production. There's also no equivalent technique for enrichment plants. So there's another problem, for instance, is that even if a state knows how much nuclear material it's used in testing, the inspectorate could never verify that fact. If I tell you that 5 tons of plutonium was used in testing, short of actually physically digging up every test that had ever been taken place, and frankly, even if you did that, you still probably couldn't verify it. But the longer that I've been thinking about this problem, the more I think that states can usefully do today to at least help mitigate these errors. Firstly, any state that's serious about disarmament, I think, should use its own production facilities as test beds for estimating past production of fissile material. Once facilities have reached the end of their life and being decommissioned, the states should develop methods and then use those methods to estimate past production. If states don't want to declare how much fissile material they've been produced, then have their own scientists with clearances do this, and then publish the results without giving away the numbers, but just explain the methodology. Second, and I really should have put this first, is investing in new techniques for estimating past production in facilities other than graphite-moderated reactors. Thirdly, any state that's serious about disarmament, when it dismantles its facilities, should keep samples from that facility and invite the IAEA to place those samples under seal, stored in the host state if the host state wants it to be, so that at some later date they can be sampled. And fourthly, this problem is getting worse over time, and all states that are serious about disarmament should create national commissions to compile the whole of the history of their program. Again, if they want to keep it secret or classified for the time being, fine, but have that information so that if and when it's needed, it hasn't decayed. That said, let me emphasize there is no technical solution, even to this technical problem. There is no way you can ever get the discrepancy in nuclear material down to less than 1 warhead. That's the bad news. The good news is there is, in theory, I think at least, a political solution to this technical problem. Verification is not an end in itself, it's a means. And it's a means to the end of compliance. And there's 2 parts to any compliance system, as I kind of flagged up at the beginning. There's the verification part, and there's an enforcement part. And if states believe that enforcement is sure, swift, and effective, they can be deterred from cheating, even if verification is imperfect. Now, looking today, I don't think enforcement in today's world can be described as sure, swift, or effective. But I'd much rather change the laws of politics than try to change the laws of physics. There's no amount of engineering that's going to reduce the uncertainty down to zero. But on the other hand, I don't discount the prospect that states intent on trying to reach a nuclear weapon-free world could decide that they're going to take enforcement much more seriously. And that enforcement perhaps could become good enough to compensate for the deficiencies in verification. So I think when viewing verification in and of itself is a technical problem. But it's a technical problem to try to serve a broader political end. And I think it's necessary both to work on minimizing those technical uncertainties while simultaneously also working on the political measures to compensate for them. Thank you very much.